everyone. I'm Lakshmi, host of the Heartfulness Pearl webinar series. Happy to have you back on Meditation, where change begins, the use of contemplative practices to promote peace, justice, and human dignity. As we are commemorating the UN Day of Peace on September 21st, we ought to be thinking deeply about a few things. What is the role of the individual in creating a more peaceful and just world? What drives the reform of social and political systems? Where does true change begin? In courts and legislatures? With political theories or platforms? In the streets? Social justice advocates recognize that to be successful, a campaign for systemic reform must move hearts and minds. This session will explore the impetus for change in the human spirit, engaging hearts and minds in the service of tolerance, peace, fairness, and justice. This presentation will explore the use of contemplative disciplines to raise consciousness on an individual level, to facilitate reconciliation, and to promote cohesion and unity among communities dedicated to change. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our presenter, Robert Perry, to you all. I'm going to affectionately call him as Bob. He began his meditation practice in 1999, an undertaking he refers to as a midlife blessing. For more than 25 years, he has worked as a lawyer in the area of civil rights and civil liberties. Bob is particularly interested in the use of contemplative disciplines to support movements for social justice. As a trainer in heartfulness meditation, a form of Raja Yoga, he has presented many programs on the use of contemplative disciplines to support personal growth and societal change. He's a member of the Committee on International Day of Yoga at the United Nations. Now, thank you for joining us today, Bob. How are you?
My honor. I'm glad to be with you.
Great. So let's begin. Here's the first question for you. The theme today of this session is where change begins. So let's begin there. Where do you think change begins?
So, Lakshmi, I'll offer a little bit further context to help folks know how I come into this conversation. As you said, I spent most of my career as a public interest lawyer, working on civil rights and civil liberties. And for many years, I pondered this question: what is it that actually precipitates systemic change, deep structural change in law and policy? And after a long time at this business of trying to change the world, I realized that I had things backwards, that I had come to understand societal change and legal change in terms of Supreme Court rulings and legislative enactments and treaties and conventions signed by the UN and member states. But it occurred to me that at the deepest level, that systemic change in civil rights, human rights, is a consequence of some greater collective capacity for empathy, for tolerance, some heightened capacity for compassion. That is, systemic change begins with individual change, and the change we see in the world begins with change in the inner dimension. For example, the racial justice movement in the United States in the middle of the last century. I don't think it's possible to understand the significance of the legal reforms adopted in the 1950s and the 1960s without recognizing that at the deepest level, this was a spiritual movement that was the cause. A political movement, to be sure, and a social movement. But these changes were the consequence, in my view, of a deep shift in the human spirit that made possible a new definition or understanding of freedom and equality, both as a matter of law, but also as how we experience ourselves as individuals in relation to others. And that's not to say that work is done. This was one important chapter in an ongoing movement for reform that will take many years to complete. So that's my short answer to your question. What drives change on this scale? In my view, it's the experience I've had in the exploration of meditation that kind of informs this work.
100%, couldn't agree more actually. Now, we chose to present this webinar in conjunction with the UN's commemoration of Peace Day. But how does inner balance or peace create outer balance, peace in the world? How can meditation, a private, individual practice, change a culture, a society?
Yeah. I hear this question often from my lawyer friends and from advocates. In the advocacy arena, we assume it's the power of ideas that make change happen. And we're very good at marketing and selling ideas. Lawyers through aggressive linear thinking, critical legal thinking skills, and politicians, folks develop, political platforms and quite sophisticated ways of telling the story about our ideas. So it occurred to me, we have no shortage of big ideas. So the question then becomes, why are we in such a mess if our ideas are so powerful? So it's not I'm suggesting that law or policy doesn't matter. Ideas don't matter. Of course they matter. But how do we evaluate these ideas? What's the measure of a good idea? It seems to me to understand the deeper truths, the larger truths of the human spirit, of what I call the human project, we need to look elsewhere. We need to look somewhere else. And to bring those truths into being within ourselves and within the world around us requires a different order of being, a different way of being. And meditation, in my view, shifts the field of perception in this regard. So, what am I talking about? What does shift the field of perception mean? I think it may be helpful for this discussion to provide a little bit of context, a little bit of overview regarding what we're talking about in terms of meditative practice and technique. So here's a little detour. The threshold task in all the contemplative practices is to quiet the mind. Why quiet the mind? Well, modern neuroscience confirms what the masters in the ancient contemplative traditions discovered millennia ago, that the mind is the source of great misery for us. It's an extraordinary organ, to be sure. Scientists tell us that our brains process many tens of thousands of thoughts in a single day, but it's this very capacity to kind of retrieve and capture stimuli and process information that can drive us to distraction, with the endless parade of thoughts, racing through our mind. Meditation brings the mind to quiet, to balance. It creates an inner peace. And in the meditative state, we actually alter our experience of who we are, of ourselves. That shifts our experience of the world around us. So one more detour on this discussion of meditation. The practice, as we understand it today, of meditation has its origins in ancient contemplative philosophies of yoga, a Sanskrit term, whose definition, as translated into English, means to join or to unite or to yoke, to connect, to make one. Now, today in the West, we think of yoga as a physical discipline. It's popularized as a highly physicalized way of practicing and seeking balance and peace. Holding postures or asanas. But in the ancient contemplative traditions, all great contemplative practices had a single goal, which was the integration of mind, body, and spirit. A sense of unity within, of oneness within, and with the world around us. Now, there are volumes of research literature that tell us about the beneficial effects of meditation upon mind and body, lowering blood pressure, relaxing hypertension, even providing some relief for various mood disorders, improving problem-solving skills. But the most hopeful and I think promising research for this conversation is that research that demonstrates contemplative practice actually enhances our capacity for empathy and compassion towards ourselves and towards others. And I have an image that actually captures that idea. It's from a New York Times op-ed, an article that was written by a scientist named David DeSteno, psychologist. And he's done a lot of research on this issue of impact of meditation upon behavior and being. And in this study of the morality of meditation, which I think is the slide earlier, there we are. This graphic is from that op-ed, and it includes this observation by Professor DeSteno. He writes, there are many studies that demonstrate even brief training in meditation can alter neural functioning in brain areas associated with empathic recognition of others' distress. These are areas of the brain that are affected by a person's feeling of association with others. So this, again, is a finding based on quite brief experiences with meditation, that we become more sensitive to our own inner state, more empathic than in our relations and our responses to other people. Now, scientists will be careful about this. They'll suggest that practicing meditation does not necessarily make us act morally or ethically. However, Professor DeSteno's research actually demonstrates that the practice of meditation actually does make empathic behavior more likely. This will depend in part upon the nature of the meditation, the quality of the meditation, and the focus of the meditation. And just to be clear, meditation in the simplest of terms is simply to maintain our attention upon one thing, a breath, a mantra. And as my teacher cautioned us, spend careful attention upon the techniques of robbery and you may become an expert robber. Mm-hmm. In heartfulness meditation, we bring our attention to the heart. And why the heart? Well, in the ancient traditions of meditation, I've been speaking about the heart is considered the seat of the soul. So that's a long way of saying change within has impact upon the world around you. And absent internal change, as I understand it, there's little hope for us having a positive effect in changing the world. So one caveat in this discussion of meditation, I'm not suggesting that contemplative practice is about disengagement from reality. It's not about apathy. And to the contrary, the practice of meditation can actually help us engage the world with greater inner clarity and greater integrity. And as we'll talk about, social justice advocates are now using those techniques for that very reason, to improve the effectiveness of their advocacy. So one last kind of thought on your question, because in the subtext to your question is an unspoken observation that I hear from many of my friends, my legal friends, which is skepticism. They're a little bit dubious about this notion that meditation can do anything to really change the world. And they'll say to me, this is, very nice, your meditation practice, and I'm sure it helps you, but seriously, the world's going to hell, and you're suggesting that I go into a room, turn out the lights, and watch my breath, or chant, Is this the best we can do? So when I hear that question, and often it's not even put as politely as that, what I do is offer a different cultural reference for this discussion about meditation. And I take a story from the Native American tradition in the US. It's actually from what is believed to be a Cherokee Native folk. And in this story, it's about a young girl, and she's experiencing a recurring dream, a nightmare, that wakes her up. And in this dream, she sees two wolves viciously fighting. And after some time of waking up with these nightmares, she goes to her grandfather who's an elder in the tribe, who's respected for his wisdom. And she relates the dream to him. And she asks him, what does it mean? And the grandfather replies, there are two forces within us. One embodies war, the other peace. And at this, the girl becomes even more agitated, and she asks him, which one wins? And the grandfather replies, the one you feed. The one you feed.
Beautiful.
We become that upon which we meditate. Or as the Buddha said, our life is shaped by our mind, we become what we think. So where we bring our attention will affect how we feel about ourselves and the people around us.
And that's why in heartfulness meditation, it's important to choose the most purest and subtlest thing that's closest to the divine to meditate upon, right?
Well, that's right. In this practice, we meditate upon the better angels of our spirit.
Yeah.
The light within our being.
That's right. Beautiful. I love that story. Thank you. Now, anyway, moving on. Can you offer some examples of social justice reformers who have employed meditation in service of societal change?
Yes, well, as you mentioned, the UN commemorates the International Day of Peace on September 21. So let's begin at the UN. Another really interesting story about movement, societal change. The UN was created just after World War I, as World War I was coming to its grim conclusion. We had nearly succeeded in annihilating ourselves as a people. And political leaders sought to create a pact among heads of state around the world with the mission of uniting peoples that had been estranged and alienated by war. The Charter of the UN commits the people of the world to collective action in service of peace, human dignity. So I have a photo here of Dag Hammarskjold was the second Secretary General of the United Nations. This is the next slide. He served in that role as Secretary General in the 1950s, from 1953 until 1961. He's widely regarded by historians as the most effective Secretary General, the most effective leader of the UN. Brilliant, both as a visionary advocate for the foundational principles of the UN, but also as a very skilled political strategist. Hammarskjold also understood that change on the order envisioned in the UN Charter, global systemic change, required what Gandhi referred to as satyagraha, kind of a soul force that is behind change. Hammarskjold is quoted as having said, "We can only succeed in achieving world peace if there is a spiritual renaissance on the planet." Now, it was revealed only after Hammarskjold's death, at least publicly, that he was engaged in what he understood to be a spiritual mission in his role as Secretary General, both as a human being and as a civil servant. He saw his calling as a spiritual calling. He kept a diary and a journal throughout his time at the UN. And in this diary, he attempted to reconcile the tension between this official role as leader of this complex global political body with what he saw as his duty as a human being, which is selfless service to all humankind. In performing that duty, and that was the duty he struggled with and wrote about in his journals, he felt he had to actually sublimate the ego, to remove himself from all of the trappings and political drama of the UN, to listen carefully and remain true to that inner self that guided him in performing his duty of selfless service. He also believed that setting aside time for stillness and solitude was essential in undertaking work and debate in the service of peace. And for that purpose, he actually created a space within the UN within the United Nations headquarters in New York City for contemplative practice. I have a photo of that room. It's the next slide. He actually had this room designed to his quite exacting specifications that he worked on with artisans and artists to execute. It's a beautiful space. This is just steps down the hall from the Great Hall where the members of the United Nations, the General Assembly, convene to do the work of that body. So it's centered within the headquarters of the UN. For people who enter that room, Dag Hammarskjold wrote a statement which was handed out to people who entered that room. And in that statement, the following words appear. And I have this, I think, in a slide for folks to read. Hammarskjold said this: "We all have within us a center of stillness surrounded by silence. This house," and this is how we refer to the United Nations, as the house where the people's work was done. This house, dedicated to work and debate in the service of peace, we have one room dedicated to silence in the outward sense and to stillness in the inner sense. He goes on. There is an ancient saying that the sense of a vessel is not in its shell, but in the void. And so it is with this room. It is for those who come here to fill the void with what they find in their center of stillness. So this is a pretty good working definition of what meditation is. Filling the void in the center of our stillness. I will add that Hammarskjold had no illusions about the state of the world. He wrote at one point, "The UN was not created to bring us to heaven, but to save us from hell." So he was a hard-headed realist when it came to engaging the world to fulfill his mission. So, another example of a social justice advocate who used contemplative practice, the great Mahatma Gandhi. I have a photo of Gandhi with some words attributed to him that I think are directly relevant to this conversation. Gandhi, of course, was a master in the use of contemplative practice, nonviolent demonstration in the service of movements for change. He built his meditation into his daily approach to advocacy, as did the people who worked with him. He's perhaps best known for his role in winning India's independence from Britain, which of course realigned global politics, fundamentally shifted the peoples of India, their understanding of them as a people, and their relation with other peoples. Now, Gandhi said something that speaks directly to this idea of contemplative practice in the service of positive change. It's on the screen. If we could change ourselves, he said, the tendencies of the world also change. As a man changes his own nature, so does the attitude of the world around him. Really interesting comment. I think what Gandhi's suggesting here is that if you are able to change your orientation to the world, there's a reciprocating energy that extends to you and to everyone around you. So there's a kind of interesting paradox here about this quiet inner state we experience in meditation as having great power. And on that point, Gandhi observed, the more efficient a force is, the more silent and the more subtle it is. And that gets to the quality of meditation that I think is important to keep in mind.
Such beautiful answer and information, Bob. Really enjoyed it. Now, moving on from there, how about you share some examples of the contemporary social justice reformers who have used meditation in the service of societal change again?
Yeah. Yes, so let's come to the 21st century and the late 20th century. We're in a moment now in the US of national reckoning with racial division and racial conflict. This is a long reckoning. We're in a new chapter of that story. It's a painful history, a history that has its origins in the American institution of slavery. So I'm going to talk about Angela Davis, an iconic figure in the racial justice movement in the middle of the last century, as she is today, and also about her sister, Fania Davis, also an important figure in the racial justice movement. Now you see a photo of Angela and her sister. That photo is from an article with the title, "The Radical World of Healing, a New Kind of Civil Rights Activism." So let me tell you about Angela Davis to begin. She was a young girl living in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, on the day that a member of the Ku Klux Klan set off a bomb in the 16th Street Baptist Church, which killed 4 young African-American girls. These girls were friends of Angela Davis and her sister Fania. Angela Davis would grow up to become a brilliant thinker and advocate, an iconic figure, as I said, in the movement for racial justice in the US. She was an unyielding and forceful critic of institutional racism. And hers was considered what was called a radical voice of Black activism. A very dangerous and courageous role to assume, especially in the 1950s and 1960s. She was fired from her teaching position at the University of California, LA, for being a member of the Communist Party, and that was just the beginning of her problems. So in this article, Angela Davis and Fania Davis are interviewed by the journalist, and it explores what was apparently something of an estrangement or disagreement in their views about social activism in the 21st century. Angela Davis had come out of, as I suggested, the political activism of the 50s and 60s. Fania Davis had left her legal practice, went to South Africa where she was studying traditional healing practices, as well as other spiritual traditions. And when she returned to the US, she left her legal practice. She opened up a nonprofit organization dedicated to the practice of restorative justice. Now, these are non-litigation strategies for addressing racial justice, human conflict, violence, a very different approach to change. And this created, as I suggested, something of a disagreement of vision between the two sisters. The story is about, I think, their reconciliation, with Angela Davis, the elder sister, recognizing the political context out of which she began her work as a racial justice advocate had shifted. It was a very different context we were operating in now, in the 21st century. And in this article, Angela Davis makes the following observation. "I think our notions of what counts as radical have changed over time. Self-care and healing and attention to the body and the spiritual dimension, all of this is now a part of radical social justice struggle. And now we're thinking deeply about the connection between interior life and what happens in the social world." And then she adds, "Even those who are fighting against state violence often incorporate impulses based on state violence in their relations with other people." This is a provocative observation, but one I find to be important. Even people who oppose state violence incorporate impulses based on state violence in their relations with other people, including allies. So, social justice advocates are now engaging this conversation. And I'm not talking about advocacy strategy here in the narrow sense. They're actually engaging what Angela Davis talks about regarding the spiritual dimension of social justice advocacy. And they're coming to terms with this observation that those who oppose state-sponsored violence sometimes act out of violent impulses. What do you do with that being? And I believe what Angela Davis is saying is that the principles reformers stand for, human rights, human dignity, fairness, racial justice, must be reflected in the strategies and tactics we take and employ in service of those principles. So Another example which will illustrate my point. I have here the photo of a book recently published. The title of the book is Occupy Spirituality. The subtitle, A Radical Vision for a New Generation. Now, for those who may not be familiar with the Occupy movement, this was a social justice and economic justice movement that began in Lower Manhattan on the steps of the great financial institutions. And their mission, their cause, was to bring attention to economic inequality and the need to understand and recognize the created for the world by gross economic inequality. Their motto was, we are the 99%. The critique being, it's the 1% that hold an inordinate amount of wealth and as a consequence drive systemic inequality. So again, this gets back to this notion of yoga as a unifying principle, one that brings people together, that heals division. And the Occupy movement was pointing to a deep division based on economic inequality. Now, the authors of this book were organizers in the international Occupy movement, and they interviewed a number of young advocates in a new and emerging generation of advocates. And what they found was what they call the emergence of a heightened moral imagination among this new cohort of advocates. And I'm going to offer you one example. These are the words of a man named Pancho. Pancho Ramos Stierle is his name. He was 26 years old when he was interviewed, and he had been arrested while meditating at a demonstration in Oakland, California, a peaceful demonstration. But meditation can be perceived as a very dangerous thing. He was arrested for meditating. And here's what Pancho says about spirituality and activism. It's time for the spiritual people to get active and the activist people to get spiritual. Because we have this idea that the self-indulgent people are just meditating. They're going to cafes and meditation centers while all this madness is happening. Or you have people at these meditation centers that are asking, how can you bring peace and calm and harmony into the world if you do not have that in your heart? I think we need both now, Pancho says. And we need to combine this inner revolution with the outer revolution to have the total revolution of the spirit. Then, only then, can you build the alternatives to a collapsing system built on structural violence. Amen.
Well said, Robert. That was a lovely quote as well. Now, can you share some examples of meditation and other techniques of contemplative practices that advocates are using to support movements of change?
Yes, yes. What Pancho talks about is actually happening in practice. So reform advocates are beginning to integrate these techniques and practices of meditation in their organizations and in the culture of their organizations, in their work and the culture of the work. So for example, people will begin a project with a group meditation on shared goals and intentions. They'll incorporate techniques of silence and reflection to create space for diffusing tension and improving communication. So there's really an interesting story developing here, and it's related to this idea and the practice of restorative justice that Fania Davis is talking about. In her work, she uses these restorative justice techniques to address really complex issues of human conflict involving violence and abuse and discrimination, tough issues. And this restorative justice model provides for carefully facilitated space in which the parties to a conflict tell their story. Both the persons who have been harmed or injured and the persons who have caused that harm. The model is non-adversarial. It's not about retribution. It's about creating accountability, about acknowledgement of the truth, about facing the reality of what happened. So this is an important development, this restorative justice approach to change. It's a reflection, this concept of restorative justice, that formal legal structures and practices are insufficient. that the legal system is really not adequate, fails to account for the complexity of human conflict, of human interaction. And for that reason, fails to effectively address both the causes and the consequences of behavior or conduct that we deem to be unlawful. So Fania Davis has written recently, among a number of other writers, about using the truth and reconciliation process, which is one form of restorative justice, to address these deep systemic problems. And one of the best-known examples of a truth and reconciliation commission is the one that was created in South Africa in the aftermath of the dismantling of apartheid. Its purpose was to address societal wounds that were left after the dismantling of apartheid. Now, I want to be clear that restorative justice and these techniques, they are not meditation. It's not a contemplative discipline, but facilitators employ the techniques of contemplative practice to address the experiences of those who have been involved in conflict. So, for example, a truth and reconciliation process requires the participants to engage in careful listening of the experience of others. They become witnesses of the lived experience of the other person. Rather than hearing my side of the story, the process creates deep silence and quiet, where you listen to the experience, not only the words, but the impact of the experience on the other person. This form of dialogue provides for a suspension of judgment. Facilitators actually help folks not engage that kind of reflective, egoistic response of self-defense. You know, no but. You hold your judgment, you hold your defensive ego responses, and sit with the experience of the other and what your conduct and behavior was. So there's a lot of attention to thought and feeling, and to suspending judgment, and to paying close attention to the experience of the other. It's your experience, my experience. Both must be honored in this practice. It's very different from a litigation model, you know, from an advocacy model in the courts, you know, in the legislature. I think the other way of thinking about the thesis that informs, or the principle that informs this work, is that, you know, a society's system of justice reflects the inner state of being of the people in that society. And a truth and reconciliation process, for example, helps us face that reality, you know, the inner reality of our world. Now, I want to add that there are critics, of course, to restorative justice and truth and reconciliation commissions. Legal critics will argue that they don't provide sufficient legal remedy, you know, a punishment for wrongdoing, damages. But in fact, these processes actually can be very effective and have deep impact because they can facilitate reconciliation. They can restore respect between the parties to a conflict. Often that is left out of any resolution in a courtroom. They establish accountability in terms that each other, now the parties to the dispute, have learned to listen to and live with, to experience. And in fact, these processes can provide for economic and other remedies if appropriate. So I'll leave my discussion of restorative justice there.
Thank you, Bob. It's interesting to know how there are other, processes as well that is kind of followed in the courtrooms. This is kind of very informative to me.
Yeah. No, it demonstrates limitations of the adversarial model of trying to get justice and speaks to the deeper truths of what we're living with when we have conflict.
Thank you. Now, is there a principle, of core philosophy of all these contemplative practices?
Yes, well, where I begin in response to that question is with what's really the first principle of all great spiritual and contemplative traditions, which is oneness. the notion that there's an essential unity within all humankind, of all being. Remember that Sanskrit definition, translation of yoga, to join, to connect, to make one, to bring disparate pieces into unity.
True.
So discrimination and the separation created by discrimination violates this first principle. Discrimination, by definition, creates hierarchy, and hierarchy becomes a rationale for separation. Separation is inherently unequal. And the opposite of discrimination is love, the unifying force of love. Not love as we use it in the colloquial sense, not romantic love or the transactional love of friendship and relationship, but a deep, abiding sense of connection, of unity, of oneness, of embracing the other with an open heart. That notion of love. And I have a photo that I think captures that idea beautifully. It's the next, I think, in the series. And it's a photo of a poster that appeared in the street in my neighborhood recently at a demonstration, a Black Lives Matter demonstration. And the words on the poster are from a writer and cultural critic named Bell Hooks. And she's written beautifully and eloquently on the concept of love as justice, of justice as love. And the love she refers to here, and the reason this poster was up in the streets in my neighborhood, is that it's an understanding that love is not a passive state of being. Love is something you bring into the world. There's no surrender in this notion of love that Bell Hooks is talking about. Love as justice, justice as love. She's actually written in another context, Bell Hooks, that love is an action, it's never simply a feeling. And perhaps, Lakshmi, that's the core principle. It's love in action. It's manifesting love as we engage the world, as difficult as that may be.
True, it is love. I mean, with love, there is greater level of acceptance so that we are able to let go and solve problems.
That's the challenge. That's the goal.
Wonderful. Now, how can we empower ourselves and each other within our families and communities by learning to act with a peaceful heart rather than with the emotional charge that creates conflict?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's one I hear often. I'm going to respond to that question regarding communities advocating for change. I'm not sure my answer applies to the familial relationship. It may, but it's the advocacy community, the change makers, that I think are grappling with this. Many who come to the work of social justice advocacy have a deep sense of that injustice, often with a personal experience of what justice and injustice means. And many still carry the pain and anger of the experience of injustice. And now they engage these issues, in the workplace, in public spaces, in the political arena. And now their pain surfaces. Now those old wounds become raw. And these advocates really can become walking casualties of the injustice they seek to end. It's a really tough work. So in her book, titled Radical Dharma, the Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams makes this observation about this challenge that you're asking about. Reverend Williams says, it's easier to just claim your progressiveness, your radicalness, your commitment to the struggle, than to actually have your despair show up. In truth, we have to integrate our wounds into our understanding of who we are and what we are really capable of so that we can be whole human beings. And this, I believe, is what Angela Davis was talking about when she speaks about self-care and healing. Angela Davis paid a high price as an advocate for racial justice and economic justice. She knows the depth of that injury. And she's telling a new generation of advocates that self-care is about empowerment. It's not self-indulgence. That we cannot be empathic or caring of others if we lack empathy for ourselves, if we lack the capacity to recognize our own grace. So that's an important message, I think. And contemplative practice, in my view, is the highest form of self-care. It's also a survival strategy. It protects the mind and the body, and it heals the soul.
True, well said, actually. It kind of helps us cope with a lot of the day-to-day struggles, keeps us balanced.
Reverend Williams, who I quoted, has a beautiful observation on this. She wrote, "We cannot have a healed society, and we cannot have change, and we cannot have justice if we do not reclaim and repair the human spirit."
Thanks, Bob. Now, coming back, I know we talked a lot about the social reformers, who want to heal the divisions that plague our country. But it's not just their responsibility, right? One might wonder, one who's listening to this webinar even might wonder, what can I do? Many of us want to make change happen to support the creation of a just and compassionate society. So where should one start? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Also a question that many of us are asking, especially in this political moment we find ourselves in. So I begin with the observation that Albert Einstein made, which is you cannot solve a problem from the same consciousness that created it. Learn to see the world anew. So that's why I advocate for incorporating a contemplative practice in a plan for change, in an advocacy strategy, in your own personal development. Change the world, change yourself. That's my mantra. But I'm going to offer another observation in response to your question. And it has to do with community, with creating community, and what some advocates are calling caring communities.
Could you repeat that? Did you say caring communities?
Caring communities, yes.
Okay.
The writer Rupert Sheldrake, he's a biologist, has published prolifically, but he recently wrote a book called Science and Spiritual Practice. And in that book, he observes that we've become disconnected from ceremony and from ritual and from celebration that bring us together and celebrate community. And these are ceremonies that affirm our connectedness as living beings. Experiences of birth and death, coming of age, the turning of seasons, the planting and harvesting of crops. These are all events that in millennia of cultural tradition afforded us a time to be together as one with a single focus of our attention, which is the community's acknowledgement of a life or a death. And we don't do that in that way. He says we've lost something important as a result of this loss of ritual and ceremony. And he suggests that these are spiritual connections, but that we don't need a religion or a dogma or a spiritual philosophy to engage in these ceremonies. Spiritual practice, he says, is not about belief, but about experience. Create that meaningful event that brings you together. The spirit will emerge. And I'll give you a really interesting example that I came across in a news account recently. The news account was about what the writer called a virtual chorus. This was a chorus of some 17,000 singers from around the world.
Wow.
Who recorded a song with the title, Sing Gently. So each member of the chorus recorded his or her piece separately. The recordings were then synchronized and performed for a global internet audience. So this is how we sing in chorus during a global pandemic. when we're living under enforced separation. But as I was reading this story, I observed that a research scientist had found that choir music has a calming effect upon the heart, that singers, the choral singers' heart rates synchronize. Many hearts become one. And I wondered if something similar doesn't happen in a meditation practice, in group meditation, which I've experienced and be quite profound in the same way that a choral group experiences a sense of oneness. So it seems to me we long for experience that connects us with each other in that way, in a deeply spiritual and connecting way, with each other and with the universe. And in thinking about this, I came across the Dalai Lama's observation about what he calls the laws of interdependence. And he writes, quantum mechanics, contemporary modern science, he said, confirms ancestral intuition that interdependence exists at a subtle level of extreme intimacy. Even in your most subtle levels of consciousness, you resonate with the solar system, with the Milky Way, with the cosmos, way beyond anything you could imagine. So I think that's a beautiful image that suggests if we listen closely, if we pay deep attention, we'll recognize that connection. It's an energetic, vibratory connection. All we need to do is be still. So I guess, Lakshmi, what I'm suggesting is, begin a meditation practice. Participate in group meditation. Create community. Open your heart. Take a risk. Cross these artificial boundaries that create separation. End of my speech.
So beautiful. So beautiful, actually. I can resonate with everything that you're sharing, Bob.
Well,
now, go ahead.
We both have experienced meditation with large groups. I'm talking about many thousands of people who sit in meditation. In our practice, it's silent. And the intensity and the depth of peace in that collective space of silence is profound. So I would invite folks to explore.
Absolutely. I second that as well. And I've experienced that as well, where we've had, if I'm correct, about 24,000, 25,000 people meditating all together in Kanha Shantivanam. That's the headquarters, the biggest ashram in the world. And it's Heartfulness meditation. So we all came together earlier this year. And when we meditated there, the egregore was quite something. The collective feeling of love was profound, just like how you had explained earlier on. So absolutely, I resonate with that as well. But anyway, moving on, Bob, on September 21st, the United Nations commemorates International Day of Peace. Perhaps we can conclude by talking about Peace Day and how proponents of peace will be commemorating that day.
Yeah. Yes. So the General Assembly created the International Day of Peace, the UN General Assembly, in 1981. And in 2001, the General Assembly passed a resolution commemorating Peace Day as a day of global ceasefire and nonviolence. That's the language from the resolution. Global ceasefire and nonviolence, a day dedicated to peace education. And on that day, every year, September 21, the peace bell at the UN headquarters is rung. I believe we have a photo of the peace bell at the United Nations. This was a gift to the United Nations from the nation of Japan. So it's called the Japanese peace bell. It was cast, the bell itself was cast from coins donated by children all over the world. And there's an inscription carved into the bell that reads, "Long live absolute peace." So when I saw that, I thought, so here's the challenge to humanity. How do we move from global ceasefire and nonviolence to what the children are calling for, which is absolute peace?
Excellent. Thank you, Bob. very interesting. Actually, it's nice to see that photo of the Japanese peace bell too. Now, at this point, for our viewers, I wanted to share. I hope you can all see this screen. So join us on Monday 21st, that's September, to this very special virtual event to celebrate peace together, with 40 million people from around the world. It's a virtual program that's put together by Heartfulness that starts at 8 p.m. local time. You can partake in this by registering here, and the website is on the screen as well. As part of the program, we have some eminent speakers like Daji, who's the spiritual guide of Heartfulness, Dr. Deepak Chopra from Dr. Chopra Meditation, Sister B.K. Shivani, a teacher in the Brahma Kumari's spiritual movement, Dr. Bruce Lipton, a renowned cell biologist, author of the best-selling book, The Biology of Belief, Amandine Rocher, UN peacemaker, Sharon Salzberg, author and teacher of Buddhist meditation practices in the West. It's an hour-long program with inspiring interviews and conversations and soul-stirring music. So I just wanted to share this with you all now, and please tune in for peace. I think it's a great opportunity, particularly while we're having this webinar in, just very close to the International Day of Peace. It is a wonderful opportunity for us all to come together and shape our future. So I hope you all can register and participate in this event. Now, coming back to you, Bob, there are a few more questions, and I want to ask them to you. Our aim is to go beyond a day of peace for ourselves and others. How can we step beyond the everyday, every minute, fears and prejudices and ego outbursts that numbs our heart's goodness? Does Heartfulness cater to this need?
Well, the word that jumps out from your question is ego. So let's begin with that word. Ego. The word I is the most frequently used word in the language, all languages, understandably. But Eckhart Tolle, the writer, has suggested that in normal everyday usage, the word I, is also one of the most misleading words. What he calls a primordial error, which I love, the phrase, a primordial error, a misperception of who you are, an illusion, an illusory self. So in these contemplative traditions of which we're a part, we understand the illusory self as a function of our overbusy ego. Our ego in a state of constant distraction, preoccupied by perceptions and thoughts and feelings about protecting our sense of who we are, our ego. It's about our job or about money or about status. We're constantly processing this information to shore up our sense of ourselves, to make sure we're okay, right? But these distractions obviously leave us in a state of dissatisfaction, of unfulfillment, even despair. So why are we chasing after these illusions? It's the nature of the human predicament. The Buddhist teacher and writer Judith Leaf has said, these attractive distractions actually become the foundation of who we are, as defined by our I, by our ego. And we become distracted, she writes, from the challenge of confronting our own wisdom, from facing what is most heartfelt, raw, and true about who we are. That's what we lose when we're caught up in the surface business of trying to shore up our ego and chasing after the illusions of fulfillment. So she's suggesting the answer is inward and suspension of our chasing of the elusive ego, the illusory self. Now, Eckhart Tolle has said the good news is if we can recognize illusion as illusion, it dissolves. Meaning the recognition of illusion is its ending. So that is hopeful message to folks who want to pursue a contemplative practice. We can surrender to a deeper understanding and experience of self by giving up, this ego preoccupation. In meditation, we actually develop the skill or the facility to discern the reality of who we are. We relax our grip on this illusory self, the ego.
Thank you, Bob. In heartfulness meditation also, since I practice heartfulness meditation, I can talk for that it is certainly a continuous improvement, a process allowing us to rise above self-centered responses, having less concern with personal desires and becoming more accepting. So, I just wanted to add that to what you had said. Now, is there any specific tool or practice in heartfulness technique that could help in, detoxing anger or fear?
Yes. So yes, aside from the formal practice of silent meditation, there are many techniques in the heartfulness contemplative practice that address those feelings, those difficult feelings of anger or fear. Physicists and neuroscientists tell us we're essentially energy fields, highly sensitive to the energy in the fields around us. And we experience or register emotions and feelings of joy or sadness or happiness or anger deep in our bodies, actually at a cellular level. It's an energetic kind of vibratory experience of these emotions that the body registers and holds. And you can see this as illustrated in the title of the book, The Body Keeps the Score. This is a book about the way we experience intense emotion or conflict or difficult emotion in the body and carry it. So heartfulness meditation actually provides some very simple techniques for releasing from our bodies, from our thought patterns, these difficult, energetic, residual charges that we carry based on our daily experience. And often we don't even see them, Anger is what scientists, psychologists call a cover emotion. It covers up a lot of other feelings like fear and insecurity and a concern of being trapped. All of those feelings exist in our minds, but below our awareness. And what these meditative techniques can do is help us release the charge we're holding. We visualize the stress or the anger or the fear or whatever we're holding in the body, and we release. It's often done with a trainer, but once you've learned the technique, you can do it on your own. The guided relaxation, for example, we do at the end of the day, but that technique can also be very effective at any time during the day when we find ourselves out of balance, upset by an exchange. And rather than engaging in a reactive or impulsive way, we can step back, do a guided relaxation, bring ourselves back to balance, and then we're better able to engage other people, work in an effective and balanced way.
Thumbs up to that. And I think we'll give our audience a little experiential session at this point. I'd like to call this From Anger to Love, Heartfulness Meditation. So let me, pull up this slide. So everybody else, please join me. Sit comfortably and close your eyes. Now this session is going to take about 5 minutes or so. Now let's begin with the toes. Now wiggle the toes and feel them relax. Relax your ankles and feet. Feel the energy from the Mother Earth entering your legs through the ankles, relaxing the calf muscles, knees, thighs, and hips. Now feel how both your legs are completely relaxed. Take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. Now relax your seating area, hips, stomach, and waist. Breathe in and breathe out. Now feel this energy in your back. From the top to the bottom, your entire back is relaxed. Breathe in, breathe out, and relax. Now relax your chest and shoulders. Feel your shoulders simply melting away. Now let the energy flow into your arms, relaxing the upper arms, lower arms, hands, all the way to the tip of the fingers. Now feel how both your arms are completely relaxed. Relax the neck muscles. The energy is moving up your face, relaxing the jaws, mouth, nose, cheeks, earlobes, eyes, forehead, all the way to the top of the head. Now feel how your whole body is completely relaxed. Now gently draw your attention to the heart. Imagine the source of light that's already illuminating your heart is pulling and attracting your attention inwards. If you have disturbing thoughts, gently brush them aside and treat them as passing clouds. And bring your attention back to the light in the heart. Stay still and quiet and absorbed in this light for a couple of minutes. That's all. You may gently open your eyes and come back to the present moment. So thank you all. Now feel free to do this every day. It's only a very small experiential session that we could offer in these webinars, but you can meditate for a longer time if you feel like. We have guided relaxation and meditation sessions on YouTube as well. Just have to type in Heartfulness guided relaxation and meditation and you will have those videos, so you can try it out at the comfort of your homes. So we've almost come to the closing. So I just want to sum up on what Bob has been talking to us about. He's been sharing with us that world peace is achievable once individual peace is at hand. The simple methodologies of the Heartfulness way will help with that. Now, because of the infinite potential of the human heart and mind, the power of thought to direct change, and the power of love to conquer all. Now, when they are in sync, when we practice heartfulness, heartfulness promises that the process will lead or will get us to peace, and peace will flourish in all our lives. And I sincerely pray that happens for all of us as well. Anyway, I think this is one of the most interesting webinars, a very heartfelt one, Bob. And you have shared a lot of information, and I'm sure you have inspired all our listeners to give meditation a try. So thank you, Bob. Truly, you are an inspiration.
Oh, my honor. Thank you.
And thank you to all our audience too. I look forward to seeing you in the next Pearl webinar on October 3rd on mindfulness with Pranahuti. The speakers are Victor Kannan and Vasco Gasper. Until then, take care. Bye for now.